wave of lockdown diaries written by French writers since the COVID-19 pandemic, author Chloé Delaume wrote the following tweet. Personnellement, je grossis en écoutant Indochine, du coup, ça manque d'enjeux narratifs pour faire un bon journal de confinement. Replete with irony, this comment, delivered through social media, nevertheless provides an uncanny portrait of the lack of structure and productivity that have come to characterize our current situation. Furthermore, Delaume soon found herself contradicted by one of her followers, fellow writer Joachim Séné, who asked, c'est un peu le reboot de J'habite dans la télévision, making reference to one of Delaume's own novels, to which she confessed, ah, mais c'est vrai, j'ai déjà été confinée sévère, smiley face with two chins. This exchange struck a chord and got me thinking about how our experiences of confinement in what some call our Netflix age have become increasingly dominated by the presence of screens. I'm sure we're all too familiar with online teaching platforms such as Zoom, Microsoft Teams, etc. And moreover, how the screen has come to play a central role in our confined reality. Another interesting text I was looking at leading up to this presentation comes from French film theorist Doug Savignon, who noted that a common reaction to the deserted streets and widespread anxiety during Paris's lockdown was to observe c'est comme dans un film. So combining this with Delaume's exchange on Twitter, what I might suggest is that a more accurate observation would be that what we're living is rather like a TV show, repetitious and resoundingly uncreative. So in this presentation, I want to focus on the representation of confinement and what the author terms Téléréalisme in J'habite dans la télévision, an auto-fictional experiment in which Delaume narrates 22 months of non-stop television viewing. In doing so, I would like to explore what this text can tell us about contemporary experiences of confinement, mediation, and mediatization. Tracing the author's trajectory across her initial project of decrypting and resisting the media's influence to episodes of inevitable passivity, I will examine the effects of isolation and mediation on the narrator's subjective experience while drawing on film and screen theory by Giebel, Paul Virilio, and Jean Baudrillard. I will then conclude by considering how the experiences of Téléréalisme seen in this novel dialogue with Delaume's own autofictional project and the critical nature of social media in her most recent text, Mes bien chères sœurs. So beginning with J'habite dans la télévision. So this text begins with an act of literary confinement as the author outlines a framework and parameters of her experiment with an all too familiar sentence, le salon sera mon bureau. Delaume explains that she will spend every waking moment exposed to and subject to the television, avoiding breaks and leaving the apartment at all cost. Already, Delaume's text appears as a direct reference to the form of confinement described by Baudrillard in his 2001 essay Télémorphose, in which he states that society has been taken prisoner by its obsession with reality television. Delaume's own approach is framed as a response to the declaration made by Patrick Lelay, the director of major television network TF1, in which he explains that television's job is essentially to help Coca-Cola sell its products by in turn selling available human brain time to Coca-Cola. As he states, ce que nous vendons à Coca-Cola, c'est du temps de cerveau humain disponible. Television, according to Lelay, is thus not simply a mode of communication, but also a process of control. Delaume's reaction to this statement is to assume the task of scrutinizing and deciphering the programs whose mission is to entertain, relax, and prepare the brain between commercials, By documenting her reactions to these multiple stimuli, Delaume hopes to understand how and when her brain makes itself available. This mode of resistance is communicated in the text through the inclusion of various statistics, from the amount of time the average French person spends watching television throughout their life, 11 years and 4 months, to the amount of salt they consume in a year, 4 kilos, as well as through the analysis of television programs, such as the 7-page breakdown she gives of the reality TV show Star Academy, kind of French X Factor, where the participants spend the duration of the competition confined in the walls of a chateau. However, despite this initial attempt at resistance, the narrator's reliability is soon undermined, as in the ensuing pages we see the gradual impact of non-stop television viewing on Delaume's subjective experience. This begins with involuntary cravings. After watching the 2004 documentary Super Size Me, Delaume confesses to feeling une impérieuse envie de Big Mac pendant le générique de fin. Likewise, finding that everybody eats chips on television, she quickly develops a taste for Lay's potato chips, leading to a rather grotesque enactment of Lay's initial declaration, in which the author imbibes 2.5 liters of Pepsi. These episodes highlight Delaume's increased proclivity for consumption. As she observes, depuis que j'appartiens à la communauté de téléspectateurs, mon appétit grandit, une voracité intrigante. These descriptions would appear to confirm Deleuze's contention that TV is social engineering in its purest form. However, we might also suggest that what Delaume's narrator experiences is a form of bioengineering, as her cravings are accompanied by a series of physical reactions. So in the text, she records these through a scientific log as a list of modifications. Changes include frequent migraines, as well as weight gain, a skin imbalance, and a growth towards the internal edge of her left eye. Such reactions heighten the materiality of the experiment's effect on the narrator, as she's physically transformed by the act of television viewing. However, it is rather the incorporeal transformations she experiences which appear to be the most concerning result. These she lists as the modifications plus graves. As Delaume explains, she is no longer able to distinguish between her own critical perspective and that transmitted to her through the screen. As she writes, le sujet, in this case Delaume, ne dit plus sur France 2, ils ont dit, alors que sur TF1, suivi d'un développement, le sujet ne dit même plus à la télévision. Le sujet ne dit plus, il répète. Et il fait sienne la voix de la télévision. Désormais, il paraît. Finding herself repeating stock phrases, Delaume enters into a state of what she terms téléréalisme, where generalized viewpoints, without a subjective point of reference, have removed the limits between fact and opinion. The narrator's experience here echoes Paul Verrey's theory of the logistics of perception, which he sees as a telescoping of near and far, obliterating our experience of distances and dimensions. The sense of flattening produced by the television's lens is well demonstrated by Delaume's description, with at one point the narrator admitting that elle n'arrive plus à hiérarchiser ce qu'elle engrange. These effects also bleed into the novel's narration. The book itself is structured as a series of nondescript pièces, each accompanied by a serial number. Likewise, the content is presented as a flux of information. The narrator moves seamlessly between presentation of statistics, journal entries, scientific logs, dot-pointed analyses, TV programs, and even a letter to the late Deleuze asking for help. Delaume's syntax is both fragmented and fluid. Her sentences interchange between short, repetitious aphorisms and long lyrical verses, which bring together a mix of technological and popular vocabularies, thereby echoing the degraded distances and dimensions of téléréalité. This infiltration culminates in an act of assimilation on the narrator's part, whereby she adopts the persona of La Sentinelle and becomes one with the chateau, the fictional setting of Star Academy. In doing so, we can say that she performs her very own télémorphose, as her narration disrupts the distinction between the corporeal, the incorporeal, the sentient, and the inanimate. As she writes, Je suis la horte du château, je palpite entre ses murs, tout du moins pour l'instant, vif argent, je circule, serpente entre les pièces, des lambeaux de lustre de plastique, je me faufile avec une essence mécanique, je ne suis plus disjointe, je suis un élément. This rather equivocal ending leaves much open to interpretation. On the one hand, it would appear that Delaume's experiment has been a failure, that her narrator has fallen prey to the very processes of control that Deleuze and Virilio warn against. In fact, in the final page of the novel, a form completed for the Ministère de la Culture et du Divertissement deems the book bon pour destruction. However, such a reading overlooks the creative energy expressed in the lyrical paragraph here. So what I would like to suggest is that rather than a failure on the author's part, this ending, along with the blurred rhetoric of realism and téléréalisme, can be read as a form of oblique engagement. And this is something that Delaume scholars have raised in other texts and other analyses, such as Don Cornelio's analysis of activism in this very text. The way I'm framing this for the moment is I'm thinking about the reference made to Deleuze in pièce 18/27, and the final description of Delaume becoming the aorta of the chateau. So for me, this evokes something of an inversion of Deleuze and Guattari's notion of the body without organs, which for them is this idealized image of the individual moved from the so-called stratification of daily life. So in Delaume's text, rather, what we find is a series of pulsating organs stripped free from their body. This process is not portrayed as one of constraint, but rather liberation opening out to infinite possibilities. This interpretation might still appear paradoxical, however, perhaps less so when read in light of Delaume's overarching autofictional project. And this is something that Joshua Armstrong has also referred to in his recent book. So the destabilization of the narrator's positioning evoked on the previous page can be seen throughout Delaume's own body of work, which is frequently punctuated by the repetition of the phrase Je m'appelle Chloé Delaume et je suis un personnage de fiction. We also find explicit instances of corporeal deconstruction, such as in Une femme avec personne dedans, in which she writes L'identité fictionnelle que l'autrice établit pour sa personne n'a donc plus besoin de corps, puisqu'elle existe dans le roman. So these images of fluidity and flattening affected by mediation thus take on critical potential in Delaume's oeuvre. And this can also be traced in her most recent text, Mes bien chères sœurs, written in response to the Me Too movement in France, which also appeared under the guise of the hashtag Balance ton port. So in this manifesto, Delaume declares that Internet a libéré la femme là où Moulinex a échoué. And in doing so, she calls for a new form of horizontal social organization, or as she terms it, sororisation, which appears to mirror the flat plane and web-like structure of the media platform. So to conclude quite quickly, I'll say that without denying the negative effects of the screen's omnipresence in our reality, what we find in Delaume's writing is the possibility of new modes of critical engagement, made possible through active participation in and the articulation of our own mediation. As she writes at the conclusion of J'habite dans la télévision, je n'ai pas su protéger mon cerveau. Son temps est aboli. Il n'est que disponible. Mais au moins, voyez-vous, j'ai ma narration propre. Sachez sauver la vôtre avant qu'il ne soit trop tard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Françoise. That was absolutely brilliant. I'm sure everyone else is having a lot of really exciting thoughts about that. Do feel free to put your questions in the chat at this stage. You know, don't just sit on them or forget them. They can sort of be sat there ready and waiting for when we come to the Q&A portion. But for now, I'm going to move on to introduce our second speaker for the morning, who is Ciara Gorman, who is a first-year PhD student at Queen's University Belfast, working on the representation of female villainy in the 21st century French crime novel. She recently presented a short expose of her work in video format, which can be found on the IMLR postgraduate webpage. And today she'll be presenting for us a paper called Good Housekeeping, Confinement and Criminality in the Domestic Space. Thank you very much, Ciara.
Morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here this morning. I really enjoyed your paper, Françoise. Thanks, Emil. I'm just going to share my screen, so you should be able to see my PowerPoint right about now. Yeah, okay. So like Jessica last week, this morning I too will be talking about Leïla Slimani's Chanson, douce, a novel about a nanny who murders the children that she cares for. Both it and another one of the novels in my corpus fit the themes of class, confinement and criminality quite neatly, which is highly convenient for today. That other novel being Karine Giebel's Toutes, blessent, dernière, which is the story of a Moroccan child named Tama who was sold into modern slavery in France as a domestic labourer. Louise and Tama are both responsible in different ways for the maintenance of the family units that they work for. And I use the term work very loosely here to describe Tama's slave labour. And that's why this paper's title references that staple magazine in the English-speaking world of domestic know-how, Good Housekeeping. Because in the Venn diagram of representations of class, confinement, and criminality in these two novels, I would locate home and housekeeping right in the centre. This conversation about the nature and assignment of domestic work is one that we've been having for a long time, from Friedan to de Beauvoir to contemporary academic work on childcare practices. This paper aims to contribute to that discussion by focusing on how a select cast of characters experience confinement in the domestic space specifically, and how that confinement relates to criminality. We can start this discussion by asking the question, who works in the home? In both of these novels, the majority of at-home childcare and house maintenance is done, unsurprisingly, by women, by mothers, nannies, and domestic slaves. Miriam in Chanson, douce is the mother of Adam and Mila, and they're the children who are later murdered by their nanny. And at the beginning of the novel, she chooses to stay at home when Mila is born. Mila quickly becomes the center of her parents' world. Miriam really seems to blossom in her new maternity. She really enjoys being at home. Her life at home comes to resemble this kind of cocoon that kind of protects her from the outside world. And so she decides to have a second child in order not to have to leave that cocoon. But the arrival of Adam changes everything for her, which we'll come back to in a minute. And so she decides to return to work. Miriam and Paul then hire a nanny named Louise to care for their children at home. Louise bonds immediately with the children, and she also voluntarily takes on the burden of housekeeping. She washes, cooks, cleans, changes the sheets, perfumes the wardrobes. On the surface, she's the epitome of good housekeeping. Miriam feels that Louise both evokes and fulfills her own personal fantasies of the perfect family and what that looks like. Louise starts to stay longer and longer hours in the Massey household, and sometimes overnight, meaning that Paul and Miriam can and do take on more at work. Their salaries increase, and so does their independence, their stability, all of it resting on the labour of Louise. Singa notes that this is the interdependence that underpins social life, where notions of independent living sometimes obscure our dependence on the work of paid care in the home. In this novel, the lives of Louise and the Massey family become so entwined as to later become lethal. However, what Louise willingly gives to the Masseys is forcibly extracted from Tama, who's the girl from Toutes, blessent, sold by her father on her 8th birthday for 80 quid to a French Moroccan family in Paris. This extract on screen is from an article about the lives of domestic slaves in the US right now, and the highlighted part reads as follows. Imagine you are locked in your own private prison. You do not speak the same language as your subjugator. On the rare occasion you are escorted off the premises, you are forbidden to talk to anyone. You are often fed the leftover food of the children you are required to watch while completing your around-the-clock household chores. You've never been paid for your labours and are sometimes physically abused by the woman of the house. This is an exact description of what Tama experiences as a slave in Toutes, blessent. Tama lives in subjugation, the running of the household, the preparation of meals, the care of children who are barely younger than herself, brutal violence and sexual abuse. All of this is what life is like for Tama at home. Seemingly respectable families are propped up by the slave labour of a child younger than their own children. This is no far-fetched story. The Institute for Modern Slavery in Liverpool estimates that there are about 40 million people enslaved in the world right now, in prison labour, in prostitution, for organ harvesting, or to pay off debts. There are Tamas in every city in the world, maybe in your apartment block or in the house next door to you. I use the word caste deliberately in the title for this section because it indicates that there are class differences between the characters who are working in the home, and those differences are best represented by this kind of crude graphic. At the top, we've got Miriam, middle class, stable income. She has the freedom to spend her money on childcare. She also has the luxury of a nanny with really flexible hours who voluntarily keeps house for her as well as minding the children. Miriam has to renegotiate her relationship with the domestic space as a matter of necessity for her mental health, but she can do so because her finances permit it. Then a rung down, we've got Louise, who I think does enjoy caring for children, but because her job is childcare in the home, there's no clear-cut delineation between what's her job and what's her own life, between the idea that Louise minds children for money and not necessarily for love. And this means that she, and others like her, are extremely vulnerable to exploitation by her employers. That exploitation can look like working longer hours than she's contracted to do, if there's a contract at all, being expected to do other household tasks like laundry and general cleaning, or being emotionally abused by her employers. Her job links her inescapably to the domestic space and to the physical and emotional labour that it demands. And then bottom rung, we've got Tama, the slave, doing all the same work as Louise, but absolutely not voluntarily and in worse circumstances, as we'll see in a minute. The line between Tama and Louise is so thin as to be see-through. The story of women's experiences in these novels seems to get darker as you descend in class. So now that we've established our cast of characters, we can examine how each of them lives a particular kind of confinement in relation to the domestic space. That word confinement for me evokes that kind of old-fashioned lying in period or postnatal confinement where new mothers were encouraged to stay at home and in bed for a month or so to kind of recover from the birth and bond with their newborn. But it also conjures up images of confining women to sanatoriums for things like hysteria. Already here, we've got three distinct themes: motherhood, the home, and mental health. And all three of these are important to how I read confinement in these novels. For Miriam, if we start with her, her experience of confinement is closely linked to postpartum depression, which she develops after the birth of Adam. With two children, everything gets more complicated. Going to the doctor, giving baths, doing the housework. She starts to really feel the days get in on her. She starts laughing to herself in the street and committing petty larceny just to feel some kind of control. Rosika Parker's theory of ambivalence in mothering comes to the fore here in Miriam's experience of maternal confinement. She loves her children and she feels like they're eating her alive, like she's losing her sense of self in the pressure chamber of childcare. Like the only things she has to talk about are what the children did that day and conversations that she's overheard at the supermarket. The cocoon of their apartment where she once felt secure and happy very quickly becomes carceral. She feels locked in and shut away from the world that she used to know. The only way out of that kind of suffocation for Miriam is to return to work. And so Louise comes to co-occupy the mothering position in the Massey home. The employment of a stranger in the home to do intimate care work is, as MacDonald explores, a complex situation that can create tension between parents and carers over who does what and how mothering work should be done. Added to that tension for Louise is the pressure that placed on her job with the Masseys by the facts of her personal circumstances, which ultimately leads to a sense of mental and physical confinement. Louise is estranged from her daughter, and pours all of her yearning for love and intimacy into the children that she cares for, only to be psychologically crippled when those children grow up and no longer need a nanny. Her husband is dead, and his deaths are choking her. Thus, her position in the Massey household is of paramount importance. Emotionally and financially, she can't afford to lose it. When her place is threatened because of her husband's deaths, things take a terrible turn. Bouts of paranoia and depression seize her. They confine her in this kind of terrible spiral of anxiety that finds a release in the macabre display of a chicken carcass in the kitchen, in very dark and melancholy bedtime stories for the children, and in frightening thoughts of death. So great is her distress at the thought of an imminent loss of stability and intimacy that she feels unable to leave the apartment where once she actively sought refuge and solace. She's rooted to the couch, staring at the TV, deaf to the pleas of the children. She is confined to the deadly hurricane of her thoughts with traumatizing results. Tama too shares this sense of mental confinement as her sense of self is eroded by the abuse of her slavers. She sees herself as weak, deserving of nothing, hardly even existing. This isn't surprising because not only is she mentally confined to worthlessness, to an underclass of existence, she's physically confined in the home as well, in a way that's much more obvious than Miriam and Louise. In the first house she works in, from age 8 to about 13, Tama is forced to sleep in the utility room. She's regularly locked in there for punishment, deprived of food and medical aid, and is absolutely forbidden to step outside into the garden in case the neighbours see and call the police. And then when she's moved from there, she's moved into kind of a loggia in her slaver Maida's apartment, where she doesn't even have a mattress or access to a toilet. One character, upon seeing this place, asks if Maida has a dog who sleeps in there. She is rescued, and I use the term loosely from here, by Maida's son Isri, who takes her to this kind of villa in Marseille. And while they establish a nominally consensual relationship, it's important to highlight that Tama's 15 and Isri's 21, and he expects her to kind of keep house for him and also to be his sexual plaything. It takes some time before he grants her permission to leave the villa, and even at that, he has her followed when she leaves. She's restricted in her movements in the town, and he forbids her from making friends. So she's then like shut up in cupboards and sheds. She's beaten, raped, threatened with death. The whole novel is just a movement from one physically and mentally oppressive domestic state to another. And so we're coming now to the final section of this paper. Just as confinement is represented in various ways in these two novels, so is criminality. Louise's crime is the murder of Adam and Mila, and it's a desperate act at the culmination of an intense descent into paranoia, terror, and depression, a descent that's triggered when her husband's deaths threaten her job with the Massey family. Louise teeters on the edge of financial and emotional instability, exhausted by years of caring for others, yearning for a secure home to rest in, to be loved in. Gripped by terror for the future, a terror that's trapping her in morbid thoughts and in the apartment itself, she comes to believe that the only thing that will secure her position in the house is a third baby. But Adam and Mila are too noisy, too demanding. They're getting in the way of their parents thinking about that third baby. And so Louise, her mind no longer her own, acts in desperation, destroying the family she longs to maintain with the misguided slice of a knife. We can never forgive Louise's crime, but we can understand it, which is something, precisely because we've been the Virgil to her Dante as she descended into her own personal version of hellish confinement. Tama too murders in desperation, but in a way that we're much more disposed to forgive. Both of her victims are about to either kill or rape her, and Tama, armed with a kitchen knife with a broken bottle, the weaponry of the home, seizes her chance when it comes. What's possibly more interesting to look at here is the criminality of the system or the network in which Tama murders and in which she is confined. Tama's violence is almost incidental to the hundreds of acts of assault and battery to which she is subjected, from an iron between her shoulder blades to lashes of the whip, nails through her hands. Her slaver openly states, "I own her, I can treat her as I like," and her boyfriend is a mobster. The very networks of modern slavery are predicated on corruption, violence, and human trafficking across state lines. Tama does kill two men, but in this context of criminality in which she lives, we really kind of barely bat an eyelid at it. Crime novels sometimes get flack for treating murder and violence as if they're some kind of cozy puzzle to solve, but that's really not what's happening in this novel. Giebel's aim is to make visible the reality of a criminal milieu that confines millions of people, mostly women and children, to lives of brutality, violence, and despair. If we don't come away from Toutes, blessent feeling kind of nauseous in the knowledge that Tama's story actually happens, we really haven't been paying attention. And so, in conclusion, what can we take from these two novels and their representations of class, confinement, and criminality? I think it's a fresh way to read and understand the confinement of women in the 21st century. It's not sanatoriums, it's not lying in hospitals, but it's still mental health and it's still the home. It's still the labour of childcare and housekeeping in the same way that it has been since the dawn of time. What these novels highlight for me are the modern pressures that contribute to contemporary experiences of confinement. Financial precarity, lack of access to mental health services, and social estrangement are contributing factors to the confinement of Louise and to her resulting criminal acts. Modern networks of slavery and the blindness of communities to the suffering of others creates a confined world of brutality, like a snow globe, where Tama must resort to physical violence if she is to escape. Most of all, we can see that in these stories, confinement, in the home or in the head, by a criminal gang or by the cradle, is a condition still deeply connected to what Singh terms the persisting exploitative features of domesticity. Thanks a million.
That was absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much, Ciara. Really, really interesting. I'm just wondering if anyone would like to kick us off with a question. They can raise their hand or just unmute or... Okay, lovely. I will, we've got first question here from Oliver Davis for Françoise. Oliver, do you want to turn your mic off? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much, Françoise. I really enjoyed the paper. I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more about the contrast between the two media, so between television in J'habite dans la télévision and social media in Mes bien chères sœurs, because it seems like there's a there's a sort of denigration of TV in J'habite dans la télévision to do with it being a kind of sort of passive medium of domination and encouraging consumption and, dramatized in those moments you talked about of the kind of sort of consumption of Pepsi and so on. And then there's a kind of a sort of idealized horizontality in Mes bien chères sœurs of social media, this idea of le terme sororité implique l'horizontale. And I'm just wondering, it seems like a really neat contrast, but also I'm wondering if the fact of the kind of TV, the fact that she's able to write this kind of TV journal shows that there can be an active engagement with a form that encourages passivity. But and by contrast, kind of in Mes bien chères sœurs, there's a sort of there's less engagement with the form of social media. I just wondered if you could say a bit more about the contrast between the two.
Absolutely, I think that's a very accurate and important point to make. So thank you for that question. I think that certainly what I was working towards at the end was what you mentioned there, of that possibility of an active engagement, not necessarily with the program itself, but the medium. And the way I was thinking about it was more in terms of the screen itself and the mediation of reality through the television screen. Although I do agree that examples such as her analysis of Star Academy very, very well delineate that strict hierarchical formula that's used in reality TV in particular. I think absolutely in Mes bien chères sœurs, she really valorizes this kind of horizontal engagement made possible through social media. However, she is also critical of social media itself. I was reading an interview that she gave during the lockdown where she admitted that she had stopped using social media as much as possible because she just found it quite hard to deal with. And at one point she describes Instagram as kind of like a parade of des tableaux vivants. So I think there's always this kind of interplay between perception as an agent of constraint and control, and also the possibility of new engagement, of activism and agency.
That was brilliant. Thank you, Oliver, for the question, and Françoise for your answer. That was fantastic. We have a comment here from Ashley Harris who says, thank you for those interesting papers. And we've got a question, another question for Françoise from Dawn, who says, thanks for your very interesting paper. And she asked, have you had a chance to consider the double use of chateau? She often refers to the literary establishment as a chateau she is excluded from, and in this text, there's the Chateau of Star Academy.
That's a really fantastic question. I hadn't made that connection yet, but I think that is a really important thing to consider. I had been looking a little bit at the Delaume's description of the Banana Republic of Letters, which is another way she refers to the academic establishment, and in terms of that reference, I've just been thinking about the way she comments on kind of like the commodification of the establishment itself. And I wonder if that links in as well. But I would invite Dawn to join in the discussion if she's interested, because I'm by no means a Delaume expert at this stage.
All I can say is that I had never thought of linking those two ideas, and it's your paper that sparked that association between those two things. So I don't have anything to add on that topic either, but I think you might have touched on something to develop if you bring this work forward. So very well done.
Thank you very much. That's fantastic. Thank you.
And we've got another question from Amelina.
Hello, hi everyone, and thank you to Jess and Jemima and Shirley for organising this. I'm so delighted to be in this virtual space with you all and to have some contact with this amazing network. I have a question for Françoise. It's about the brain. And I confess that I haven't read J'habite dans la télévision, so forgive me if this question comes from a place of ignorance, but I was really interested in that final quotation where you were talking about the narrator saying that she didn't know how to protect her brain, but that she has her own narration. And it got me thinking about the relationship between the brain and narration, or perhaps the mind and narration. And I wanted to ask a little bit more about Delaume's use of the word brain, which is of course a word that we would associate with neuroscientific or neurobiological models of thinking about the brain versus the mind. And if you look at some of these ways of thinking that emphasize the affective, the material processes of the brain, much of that goes back to Deleuze and Guattari. And I was thinking, I'm thinking here about their writing on the brain in Qu'est-ce que la philosophie? And I just wondered if that was something that you'd thought about, and where that leaves us in terms of the body without organs. if we have at the end of this text a kind of the sense that the narrator doesn't know how to protect their brain, but you've also emphasized the possibilities for critical engagement through the screen in relation to the body without organs. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about that relationship between the brain, the mind, and narration.
Thank you. That's another really fantastic question. I confess I haven't looked into this point much at all, but there is quite a lot of anatomical language used throughout J'habite dans la télévision, and there are many references to not only the brain but cognitive processes. So I think it's an important aspect to be addressed. I think the reference for through my very superficial thoughts on this question, the question of the representation of the brain. I was thinking about Deleuze's interview, The Brain as a Screen, and how there could be perhaps a parallel with the television and kind of like the absence of a filter and the flattening that takes place, and perhaps that experience of the body without organs becoming the organs without a body. But this is something that I'm just kind of going in circles with a little bit at the moment. So I think I'll just have to look into that a lot further. But thank you for the question.
If no one else wants to dive in, I've got a question for Ciara. Just on exploitation, really. So you've discussed sort of how Louise in Chanson, douce voluntarily gives up her sort of time and her lifestyle for the Massey family. But I just wondered whether you considered how do you see her exploitation? Do you think she's exploited? Do you think it's all her doing? Do you think after a little bit the family start to think, well, you know what, we could do with this? What do you think in terms of exploitation? Because I think as well, you compare it to, I haven't read your other novel, but it sounds fantastic, whether it's as clear cut as one person sort of volunteering and the other person it all being piled up, whether there is actually, is it ambiguous or not in Chanson, douce?
I think that's probably one of the most fascinating questions to ask and answer and to think about in relation to Chanson, douce. And the answer is no, it's not clear cut. And I think that's what makes this novel so frightening. The first thing that I said when I finished this book, I closed it and I was like, what a scary book. And it is, because there's no right or wrong answer in terms of, like, we have this impulse, I think, in many stories like this to want to point the finger. I'm coming at this from an aspect of like looking at crime novels, and that's really where a lot of crime novels want to take us. They want to take us into this space of thinking about who's culpable, who's accountable, who bears responsibility. And the answer here is that there's no clear-cut answer for between Louise and the Massey parents. The way that I read this novel is that Louise comes to them with this huge hole of yearning inside her. She wants to pour her whole self into this family. That's the nature of her job as well, which makes it even more complicated, because if she were working in, like, a shop or something, it might be different, but she's providing intimate care to strangers in their home, and that makes it much more complicated for her to kind of like make that distinction between what's her life and what's someone else's life. So on the one hand, we've got Louise coming in with all of this really deep desire to kind of give her all to the Massey family, to make herself indispensable, which she does. And then on the other hand, we've got Louise and Paul, who kind of start out at the beginning of the novel being like, we want to make sure that she's not working too many hours. We want to make sure that she's paid fairly, because Paul is always thinking in the back of his mind, well, what if she comes back later and she says that we've exploited her? But then the more that Louise makes herself voluntarily indispensable, the more Louise and Paul come to meet her in that space of mutual exploitation, because They let her stay longer hours. They don't mind that she stays overnight. They don't kind of put up any resistance to her really making herself like a nest or a home within their household. And then things get really sticky when they decide that they want to go on holidays, because they're like, sure, we'll take Louise with her. What else would she be doing with herself? Which, like, you read and you're thinking, okay, like that's really not good. We're in a new territory here. But regardless of what Paul and Miriam did, they don't deserve to have their children murdered. And that's where we push in again into a further space of ambiguity. And I think when we finish this novel and we come away, when children have died, we want somebody to blame. And this novel really resists us wanting to assign or apportion blame to people. And I think that's why it's such an important text to read, not just in the context of crime novels, not just in the context of women in the home, but in the context of how we treat people and how we think about what exploitation looks like and how insidious and almost invisible it can be until you realize, you don't notice that it's happening until it's much too late.
Thank you so much. Françoise, I just want to tell you that a few people have put some fantastic comments about the brain in the chat if you haven't seen. Jordan has a question for Ciara as well. So Jordan, do you want to take it away?
Hi, thank you very much for your paper, Ciara. I just was really interested in the idea of the co-occupation of the mothering role that you spoke about in Chanson, douce. And I just wondered how that plays out from the children's perspective. So I haven't read the text, so I just was interested to know, do the children develop an equal bond with both women? Does, to an extent, Louise replace Miriam as mother? And then actually, how does that play out in the eventual death of the children? So does that mothering role break down in Louise to allow her to come to the place of killing them, or is there still some, I don't know, slightly odd or maybe warped, we might say, notion of motherhood in the death, if that makes sense? So I'd be interested to hear that. Thanks.
That's a really complicated and knotty question. So the scholar that I cited in my presentation, Cameron Lynn MacDonald, wrote this wonderful book called Shadow Mothers, where she investigates the relationship between a select group of mothers in, I think it's Boston, with their nannies. And she's talking about mothering work as she defines it specifically as, like, in this instance, the care of small children. And that care is like emotional labor as well as the physical, like kind of bathing and all that kind of stuff, soothing them, dressing them, things like that. And MacDonald notes that between mothers and their nannies, specifically mothers in this study, there can often be a lot of tension about who does what and what mothering work looks like. So, for example, there might be rules about the nanny doing certain aspects of care work during the day, but then when the mother comes home at night, it must be the biological mother or that person who is identified as the primary carer. She gives the bath at nighttime, and the nanny's not allowed to do that because the concept of intensive mothering, which puts huge burden on mothers to be there at all times, 24/7, doing all of the emotional and physical labor for their children, or else they're bad mothers. That ideology of intensive mothering places a lot of pressure on mothers versus their nannies, because they feel like if they're not doing certain tasks, then the nanny becomes the mother. And so ideally in that situation, you need to recognize that the nanny is another loving adult in the child's life. And so it's okay to delegate tasks or share tasks. And so when we apply that to Chanson, douce, we see that Miriam is quite happy to delegate tasks to Louise. I think there are some moments of friction. We see that when, for example, Louise gets really het up about the fact that Mila has lost a gilet, and Miriam's just like, she's lost it, we can't find it, we're going to replace it. And Louise really hates that, and it's a point of like conflict between them. Then later we've got rules about like whether Louise can or can't feed the children gone off food, and Miriam's like, we're not doing that, and Louise kind of fights that back a bit. So we have tension in the mothering role evident in the novel, but I don't think there's enough. It's not that it's a fight between Louise and Miriam over who's the mother of the children that pushes Louise towards her crime. And I think that's I think in some ways that makes the story even more tragic, because we're very familiar with that construction of conflict between the mother and the nanny. We see that a lot in real life criminal cases where nannies have murdered children that they care for. It's like she was annoyed because she wasn't the mother, or the mother was annoyed because the nanny was too much the mother. That's not really how I read this novel. And I think that pushes it into a new space where we can think about mothering ideologies in a new way, because the conflict that's here is not between who's the mother. It's about whether Louise can feel safe and secure ever if she's not in a mothering role. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but it's a really interesting area to think about in this novel. So thanks for asking the question.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Are there any more questions that anyone would like to pose to our speakers? Okay, Sonia has a question for Ciara. Sonia, would you like to turn off your mic?
Yes. Hi, thank you so much for this paper. I don't know the second text that you talk about, but it seems to me that in both texts, the exploited character, the protagonist, they're denied a way out, in the sense that Louise's crime is spoiled at the beginning of the text. So we don't have an evolution, and in a perhaps cathartic is the wrong word, but we don't have a way to follow her through her exploitation and then feel like she got some sort of vengeance, or that she was able to get out of this. And Tama, you said acts in self-defense. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering what you're thinking about these two novelists who are talking about exploited characters, but then narratively speaking are also keeping them in.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I actually really like the fact that Slimani started her novel with the crime, because I think it makes that sense of pressure and confinement, which I feel anyway, not just because of this seminar. I think it makes those feelings of entrapment much more concentrated as we move through the novel, because there's, as you say, there's no way out, there's no escape. Like, we know what's coming. All we can do is kind of helplessly watch this spiral into the depths of darkness for Louise. And I think in terms of Tama, just to say, actually, I know I probably shouldn't really say this about a novel that I'm studying, but I actually hate this novel. Giebel is really trying to tell a story about exploitation and entrapment in the home and modern slavery. I've got problems with how she tells it, but everybody reads these novels, and so that's why it's important to look at them. Tama actually dies at the end of the novel, at the age of 16. I think I said her boyfriend is a mobster, and he dies in a mob hit, and she's like, I can't live without him, and kills herself in the aftermath of the mob hit, which is a frustrating end to what could have been a great story. And I think the fact that both of these women have no escape, it was kind of obvious from about 200 pages before the end that Tama wasn't going to come out of this alive. And we know obviously that Louise is probably facing, if not a coma for the rest of her life, incarceration for the rest of her life. I think the fact that we know there's no escape makes us I think more prepared to engage with other aspects of the story. That Louise is going to jail at the end, so we know that there's no possible way that she can kind of extricate herself from the mess that she's in. So I think for me that made me more disposed to thinking very hard about other ways this story could have gone. The hope for me was gone that it could have ended another way. So creatively, I was able to think more about, at what point could we have intervened? And I think in Chanson douce, there's actually very few escape routes for Louise. I think the damage is already done psychologically way before we even get to the Massé household. And short of a really serious mental health intervention, immediately, this novel was only going to go one way. So I think in some ways the confinement of the women made me think more creatively and gave me the freedom to think differently about how their stories could have gone and how we can imagine new systems of accountability, new safety nets, new ways to protect those around us from exploitation, or people that we don't know from exploitation. And I think what unfortunately Tama and Louise lose in the novels, we gain in terms of being able to think differently about how we can move forward so that stories like these don't happen in real life.
That's fantastic, thank you. Has anybody else got any more questions? Please feel free to raise your hand, put it in the chat. While you maybe think about your questions, I've got one for both speakers. Just very interested in the fact that you both touch on this in different ways, but it seems to be connected to the home in your presentations. I'm really sorry that I haven't read the novel Françoise, but I thought it was interesting to see, well, the TV, surely she means in the home, and I just wondered whether it was TV everywhere, universally, or whether it became, and whether it was a gendered aspect that, well, the woman is in the home watching the TV, and whether both of you in this sense consider the home to do with class, to do with being confined as a woman through these contemporary women writers, whether space is because we talk about the TV and how she's feeling sucked into that as a space, but is she also confined to the home space? Is the TV also in the home? I just wondered if you'd got more to say on this, both the two of you, to do with, you know, home and confinement and the themes.
That's a very interesting question. I'm not sure if it's if her actual experiment, if her actual setting is that gendered necessarily, but it is important to also note that throughout her TV viewing, she has her partner at the time, Igor, in the apartment. He comes and goes and they discuss things that are going on. He's kind of the external perspective. But I think perhaps the most kind of the gendered commentary on, I suppose, an extrapolation of confinement, and we think about going within the realm of the television, would be the way she writes about the various characters and hosts on TV programs like Star Academy, and in that sense she really comments on the way that the characters are entirely stereotyped, and they perform this very archetypal role in the program. The way they dress, the way they present themselves is very much a sense of gendered confinement.
I think for me, I was just thinking about two instances, one in each novel, where both Tama and actually Miriam meet people who don't realize the extent of their confinement in relation to the home. So like Tama is like working for this elderly woman who has believed the lie, or has willingly closed her eyes to the fact that like Tama is 13, is stick thin, and is very obviously a slave. She thinks that she's like working to pay off her school, or she's sending money home or whatever. And that woman like kind of willfully turns a blind eye to, as Singha describes it, the persisting exploitative features of domesticity. And I think in the same way, Miriam's out walking one day with her children, and she meets an old friend of hers, a colleague who's a lawyer, and who eventually does offer her a place within his law firm. But she thinks about that interaction afterwards, and she's like, you know, I don't think he even noticed my children. Did he notice that my face was kind of haggard? Like Miriam is very deep in postpartum depression at this point, and like I think what these novels show for me, as much as the other novels in my corpus, is that domesticity can be like a front. You know, it can hide a lot of really ugly things behind it. And I think even today, with, you know, all the stuff that we know about postpartum depression, or about people being enslaved, or just how like being in the domestic space all the time in a cycle of care, or even during the pandemic, can really get in on you. And so I think for me that the domestic space is always at the forefront in how I think about these novels, because I think it's like not that it's uncharted territory or that we don't pay enough attention to it, but I think it's being treated in really new and interesting ways in contemporary crime fiction as I study, which is really interesting.
That was fantastic. Thank you, guys. We have another question here from Shirley for both speakers. She asked, would both speakers be interested in making some speculative comments connecting their material to what we're starting to find out about specifically women's confinement or confinement generally in the current situation of the pandemic? So do these works offer an interesting lens for the contemporary moment?
Okay, I think perhaps a link can be to do with the processes of télétravail that are going on across the world at the moment, and I suppose the omnipresence of the screen in everybody's work life at the moment, that obviously isn't necessarily gendered explicitly. However, I think statistics have already shown that it's much more likely for women to be working from home and at the same time looking after children, taking on care responsibilities. And I think this is something that Ciara will obviously be able to add to at more length. But I think something that's also quite interesting is the way the filter of the screen influences women's place in both the public and the private spheres, where we're all becoming increasingly confined, but now have new means to engage politically, socially, etc. And I think in that case, Chloé Delaume's Mais bien chère sœur opens new possibilities, and she also commented on Virginie Despentes' recent text that was written before the pandemic began, where she reacted to the Roman Polanski scandal, and it had a very militant tone to it, and had the repetition of on se lève et on se casse, kind of encouraging this new feminist movement of not taking it anymore, reacting against the establishment. And I think her response to the pandemic after this very powerful text was to say, yes, on se lève, on se casse, mais on va où? And I think one of the only possibilities that we have at the moment in order to create a kind of a real political reaction or have some sort of far-reaching effect is through the media.
I've really enjoyed thinking again about Chanson douce, in particular in the current moment. Not so much Toutes blessent, because the fact that it's to do with modern slavery puts it in another category altogether. But Chanson douce for me, I've been thinking a lot about it in terms of exactly as Françoise has said. In the current moment, there's lots of stats and articles coming out showing that, disproportionately it's women who do the care labor in the home, and it's disproportionately women who are suffering for that during the pandemic. And I was thinking a lot about it in terms of that scholar that I cited in the presentation, Singha, who talks about the interdependence of social life and how fictions of independence, for example, Miriam returning to work, and people might see her from the outside as like, a working mother. She's got a good job, disposable income, and her children are well cared for. That fiction of independence masks or obscures or occults the huge labor that's done by people who work in the home and who are really vulnerable to exploitation, like Louise or the other nannies that she meets during the novel. And again, like, Louise is privileged in that she is white. The other nannies in the novel are often people of color who are there without visas or without papers. So like, they're in another dimension of potential for exploitation or vulnerability to exploitation. And so in thinking about how Chanson douce offers an interesting lens for the contemporary moment, it makes me think about like how, the vast network of people who work outside the home and who have now had to return home, perhaps to a partner who works at home anyway, caring for children or keeping the house, their eyes have probably really been opened to the huge amount of labor that it takes to keep a household going or to look after children of any age. And then, you know, added to that to also having to work too. So like, I think any text that deals with how women in particular negotiate that relationship between the home and work in the home is really important and very interesting to read in this moment where we're all kind of like stuck at home, safe at home, but stuck at home.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you both. Shelley says thank you for your great answers. So Jessica has posted a question for Françoise.
It wasn't really a question. I kind of put it in here because I'll say it out loud now. I may as well. I put it in here because it's more, and I hate these people that are like, it's more of a comment, but it really is in the sense of, I thought it was interesting in your presentation, Françoise, how you talked about the Coca-Cola and consumerism through screens, because speaking of the pandemic, I thought it could be interesting to think about in the recent weeks, through TV advertisement, through Spotify adverts, through all of these different ways of screens and media that we confined to our homes, we're being encouraged now to go out and spend, and we're even being sent these 50% off, vouchers to go out. So you get this strange balance between being confined in the sort of safety of our homes and being told, you know, be careful, and it's in the safety of this sort of space that we also get told go outside and go and consume. And I thought, well, this is a really interesting balance to what you were saying as well with the screen and the Coca-Cola.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very, very good point. And I think something else that I noticed only the other night when I was watching TV adverts is that there are now ads that are playing on the kind of the fact that all of our communication is happening through screens. So you're watching ads that have an image of somebody's Instagram account. You're watching ads that have an image of people on Zoom, on Skype, etc. So I think we're really getting this kind of like Baudrillard hyper-real moment that's going on. Yeah.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you. And speaking of screens, we have another really interesting question from Amelina, and this is addressing both papers. So Amelina says, there's an interesting dynamic of invisibility, brackets invisible labour, and hypervisibility, brackets the screen, that cuts across the two papers. Is there more to be said about or on the politics of, brackets invisibility, in relation to confinement?
I actually really like this question. I think for me, thinking about like the politics of in or visibility in relation to domestic work in the home, I think we broadly tend to make invisible that which we don't want to look at because it would be too scary for us. And by that I mean, like when I think about, you know, domestic work in the home and the labor that obviously men do this as well, but the vast majority of childcare and house labor, domestic labor, is done by women. So we make invisible their labor at home and devalue it, you know, in a long tradition of devaluing women's work. Because if we were to recognize it, you know, and value it properly, it would have to be paid, it would have to be protected, and that would trigger what Françoise was saying earlier on about this like horizontal kind of uprising and social reorganization that would topple patriarchy and would essentially trigger, I think, huge changes in the structure of our state policies, our finances, our economies, our governments. And so I think in terms of politics of visibility for the invisible labour at home, I think this confinement period for the pandemic has really brought to the fore this urgent need to think again about how we value and what we value in terms of work that goes on in the home. So like I would be very much on board for more novels and more academic texts and more think pieces that urge us to revalue the stuff that we have deliberately occulted, i.e. the labour of women in the home.
I also agree. This is a really, really fantastic point, and Ciara's already raised some very, very important aspects there. I think that much in the same way, there's this constant interplay going on between the visible and the invisible, and I think in terms of Delaume's work, there's a great citation that she includes at the very opening of Mes bien, chère sœur, from Julia Serrano, and who writes: La seule chose que toutes les femmes partagent, c'est le fait d'être perçues en tant que femmes et d'être traitées comme telles. So I think visibility in this sense, from the very, very opening of her text, is framed as something that's entirely central to women's social experience, and I think that's exactly what Ciara's outlined there as well.
That's brilliant, thank you. Ameline says thank you for your wonderful answers. Are there any more questions that anyone would like to pose, or comments?
I'll just make a quick comment just to Ciara, that when you sort of said, oh, I'll welcome sort of more novels and more, texts written from these experiences, just because it crosses over with some of the things that I'm doing. It's very interesting to see that there's this sort of, in the last 5 years, that we're getting sort of accounts written by cleaners, but in different languages. So there's some American writers, there's English ones, also just in newspapers now. If you type into sort of The Guardian, if you type into, what else was I looking at, possibly the Paris Review as well, definitely the Critic, for example, they all are starting to talk about the disappearance of the cleaner. Now we can't have the cleaner come in. But there's some fantastic novels as well that are written, and it sort of arcs back to the, I know you don't like him very much, but the Mirbeau, because it's this humorous way of talking about exploitation. So I think it's very interesting that we're starting to get these voices appear, or even if it's not the voices themselves, but women in the home going, well, where's my cleaner? And I think that's just a really interesting point to make when you're saying, oh, I welcome these ideas, that I'd be happy to send you some more of a bibliography on those.
Yeah, I'd be delighted. Thanks, Mel.
If we haven't got any more questions, I'd be happy now to advertise in 2 weeks' time, which is the 19th of August. We've got Beatrice Ivy from the University of Sheffield and Muriel Rebez, forgive my Spanish, from Dickinson College, USA, also speaking on class confinement and criminality. So please put that in your diaries for 2 weeks' time. It will be at the same time as well, 10 a.m. till around 11:15. We'll carry on and see how far we go. I want to say a massive thank you to our speakers today for their fantastic presentations. I think you've really gave us something to talk about, to get back into this academic rigour that we're all missing at the moment. So thank you. It's really enlightening, especially we're talking about things that we're all facing in certain ways, feeling confined and being sort of stuck in our four walls. So thank you ever so much. A huge thank you as well to Jemima and to Shirley, because without them this wouldn't be possible, and to Kathy, who sends out all our fantastic advertisements. But yes, I'd be happy to see everybody again in 2 weeks' time. And Jemima, if you've got anything to add.
Absolutely not. Just I second everything Jess has said. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Ciara and Françoise especially. They were absolutely brilliant papers, and a really rich discussion that I think we all really enjoyed being part of and watching as well. So thank you.
Oh, a last minute comment from Sonia, not a question but a comment for Françoise. Delaume's reader, who connects her current pandemic journal to J'habite dans la télévision, makes me think of the series of Le Monde articles where writers write about a past confined experience. I wondered if understanding and emphasizing with our collective present confinement is better meditated through past experiences rather than the confinement journal that have been published by writers like Slimani and Dernière, I can't even pronounce that, I'm so sorry, who participated both in the past confinement article and current journal.
Thanks, Emil. It's been lovely this morning.
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting point. I will have to look into that further. That's all I'll say at this stage. But I think that, yeah, there's definitely a lot to be said about people turning to past texts at the moment, rather than finding what they need necessarily in the contemporary genre.
Definitely. Well, thank you all so much, and hopefully see you in 2 weeks' time.
Brilliant. Thank you, everyone.